Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our first live session of this weekend's programming for the National Day of Remembrance. My name is Erin Aoyama, and I am delighted to serve as the moderator for this panel. As we gather together virtually, I invite each of us to acknowledge the Native peoples whose ancestral homelands we currently occupy, and to learn more about the past and presence of the vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. As we mark the significance of this day in history for Nikkei communities across North America, let us not, in doing so, cover over the backdrop of enslavement, genocide, and removal that animates American history. As this weekend is an occasion to reflect together on the 80th anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066, a reflection that, for me, in this moment is both somber and energizing, it feels appropriate to begin with a conversation about racial reckoning and Japanese American museums. What does it mean, and what can it look like to reckon with histories of race and injustice? How can we reckon with history in order to make sense of our present and build towards justice in the future? In this session, we will hear from 6 fantastic speakers who will each share about their work, past and present, to bring museums and communities, especially the Japanese American community, into these conversations. We will begin with Kevin Gover, Undersecretary for Museums and Culture at the Smithsonian Institution. And then we will hear from Dr. Franklin Odo, Karen Ishizuka, Hanako Wakatsuki, Shirley Higuchi, and Anne Burroughs. There will be time for questions later in the program, so please leave any questions or thoughts you would like to share with our panelists in the chat, and we will get to as many as possible. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank our planning partners, the Japanese American National Museum, the National Chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, Friends of Minnedoka, and the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Without the support of and work of our planning partners and our many community partners, this programming would not be possible. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Undersecretary for Museums and Culture at the Smithsonian, Kevin Gover. Thank you so much for being with us today, Kevin. A few words about your background. Before beginning his tenure in this role, Kevin served as director of the National Museum of the American Indian from 2007 to January of 2001. Earlier in his career, he served as Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs in the U.S. Department of the Interior under President Clinton. Thank you so much, Undersecretary Gover, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Erin, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you today, especially to talk about this important subject. I don't remember where I first learned about Executive Order 9066. It certainly was not in my public school education growing up in Oklahoma. I think it was in my college years, and I'd bet that I did not learn it in the classroom, but rather from my fellow students whose parents and grandparents had endured this imprisonment. I was outraged at the injustice, but I was also outraged that this injustice was never discussed in any of my American history classes. Over time, I learned more. For example, I learned of the attorneys who volunteered for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and that they, like my Pawnee grandfather, fought bravely on the killing fields of Italy. I learned that many of the imprisoned Japanese Americans were in camps that were located on Indian reservations. If you could show the images now that I provided. The images you're seeing are of the camps on the Colorado River Indian Reservation in California, the Poston Camp, and the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona. When I visited Gila River to talk with the Native veterans there about a memorial we were building in their honor, they wanted to talk about the internees from Gila River who fought with the 442nd and earned medals of honor, and wondered how we might honor them as well. You can take down the slides now. And I had the pleasure, the honor really, of knowing just a little bit one internee in particular who is much beloved by Native Americans, Senator Daniel K. Inouye, who took up the cause of Native American tribal sovereignty when almost no one else would, and helped create the great progress of tribal communities over these past few decades. Too few of our fellow Americans know these stories, and they really should. And that's why it's so important that we have events like this one to mark the 80th anniversary of this painful moment in American history, and also the perseverance of the Japanese American people. My friend, my boss, Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch, is fond of saying that you can tell a great deal about a nation by what it chooses to remember, but you can tell even more by what it chooses to forget. It's no secret that there have always been, and there continue to be, efforts to erase parts of the past that are uncomfortable. Museums must help the nation remember, even when it would prefer to forget. If we are truly to perfect our union, we must be honest about our imperfections, whether telling the truth about the Trail of Tears, about the Tulsa Race Massacre, or about this moment 80 years ago when we chose fear itself over the human rights of American citizens. And there are examples of the museum community working to hold up a mirror to who we are as a country and to remind us when we didn't live up to our ideals. The National Museum of American History told the story in its Righting a Wrong exhibition 5 years ago. Other Smithsonian museums, including my own National Museum of the American Indian, have conducted programs on the subject thanks to the presence and support of the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center. Yet the truth is that the Smithsonian itself has not done as much as it could have and should have to tell the stories of Asians and Asian Americans in the United States. We need to do better, and Lonnie Bunch has told us that we will do better. We tell these stories not to make anyone feel guilty, but to remind ourselves that even good people are capable of committing terrible deeds when they give in to fear. A fresh example arises from the coronavirus pandemic and the accompanying increase in the instances of anti-Asian hate crimes. The New York Police Department, for example, has reported a 300% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes in a single year. This should remind us that we are not so far removed from the type of xenophobia and hysteria that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. In response to this pandemic of anti-Asian hate, our Asian Pacific American Center has worked with units across the Smithsonian to develop resources for educators and the public that address xenophobia and anti-Asian racism. These are available online. Reckoning with the past also means engaging with the present and the future, acknowledging that history leaves a legacy on where we are today. I've been so impressed by the way cultural institutions have used this moment to try to bridge our racial and cultural differences by being places that seek to foster understanding and conversation about race, gender, and identity. The Japanese American National Museum and the Wing Loop Museum are Smithsonian affiliates. These and other community-based museums are doing great work in telling these stories from a community perspective. They show us that we can and must use our influence and reputation to do more than just be repositories of the past. We must be places of gathering, of discussion, of enlightenment. We can engage directly with our communities and help lift them up. Museums can use our scholarly resources, collections, research, and reputations as trusted sources of knowledge to help make our communities better, more livable, and more connected. And by doing that, we can dispel the notion that our neighbors are the other, that they are somehow less than American, and help prevent the wrongs of the past from happening again. So again, I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary Gover, for your words. And now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Franklin Odo, who is currently the John Woodruff Simpson Lecturer at Amherst College. Franklin was involved in the early movement to establish Asian American Studies and co-edited Roots, an Asian American Reader, which was first published in 1971. Franklin, it's really such an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Good to be here. Thank you, Erin. In 1987, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History unveiled a new exhibition deliberately created to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the United States Constitution. This was an enormous undertaking for a momentous occasion, celebrating the most important document in the United States form of democracy. The museum deliberately chose to highlight the experiences of a tiny, marginal, and marginalized ethnic group, Japanese Americans, during the turbulence of World War II. Just think for a moment. Of all the significant events that occurred since 1787, why would the nation's premier history museum select this particular series of events that many or most Americans, including Japanese Americans, by the way, would have preferred remain buried and forgotten? But not everyone had forgotten. Indeed, many Japanese Americans who had long believed that the issue of mass injustice and incarceration was best left buried and undisturbed were, by the 1980s, personally and actively organizing and mobilizing to convince the United States government to apologize and to provide financial reparations to the victims. The only occasion, by the way, in American history when the United States government has done so. This new exhibition, called A More Perfect Union, Japanese Americans and World War II, called into question America's devotion to the Constitution and its many critical elements. The new show's entrance highlighted the guard towers with armed soldiers overlooking barbed wire enclosures that penned in 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American-born citizens. The opening also featured two of the era's most respected and popular TV journalists in a stirring large-screen mock-up. The intent of the exhibition was daring and daunting. To have the American public visiting one of the most popular museums on the Washington, D.C. Mall, to have that public understand that the Constitution was all too often significant precisely because we, the American people, had refused to believe in its message and ignored the fact that its protection should embrace marginalized people like Japanese Americans. JAs. In this, the creators of the exhibit were clearly calling for us to rethink our shallow commitment to the Constitution and to deepen our allegiance to its values. Thus, the title of the show was not A Perfect Union, but A More Perfect Union, and the movement to try to achieve that. For this, the then director of the museum, Richard Kennedy, was a critical decision maker, but it fell to a curator who had been hijacked from the Air and Space Museum, a fellow by the name of Tom Crouch, to devise the main design, the major messages, and the artifacts that would attract visitors. Tom Crouch did a courageous and brilliant job, incorporating ideas, issues, events, people that upended many elements in that was part of the master narrative of those times. That narrative emphasized that JAs, as an unproblematic ethnic group that had successfully navigated American society, becoming a model for other minority groups to emulate. This model minority, for a society unwilling to admit structural and systemic flaws, making equal opportunity for all a mission impossible. The flip side of this imaginary coin was the incredible heroics of JAs in the American military during World War II. The 100th Battalion and the 1399th Engineers, all originally from Hawaii, were the first units of segregated, all JAs in uniform. The 100th was joined by volunteers in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the unit that fought long and hard on Europe's battlefield, winning many strategic battles and losing an inordinate number of killed and wounded. They were joined by the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, all over the world. Indeed, the 442nd became, for size and length of service, the most decorated unit in all of American military history. In this endeavor, Crouch and his then young assistant, Jennifer Locke, now Jones, traveled the country to seek participation from veterans of these units. I recall brokering meetings for Tom and Jennifer and the vets when I was teaching at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, in the 1980s. Also in this endeavor, Tom was critically supported with storylines and artifacts generously provided by two important organizations in and of the Japanese American communities. One was the National Japanese American Historical Society, led by Rosalind Tonai. The other was Go for Broke, Inc., led by Eric Saul. Rosalind and Eric were critical to the success of this show. I remember visiting Crouch at the museum before the exhibit opened, and he showed me a folder containing hate mail accusing him of denigrating the very idea of the Constitution by pointing to the ways we had failed to live up to its principles. There was even, I remember, one death threat. As Yogi Berra once famously said, déjà vu, all over again. Today, those of us who teach and research and write or publish art, films, plays about the World War II camps pay considerable attention to the vigorous ways JAs were actively engaged in this process, not simply abject and stolid victims. One example was a modest but outstanding section of the exhibition, showing that a number of young men refused to comply with the 1944 order imposing the draft. Difficult to imagine now, the government drafting men into the army to fight for the country that had imprisoned them and their families for no reason other than the country that their parents had been born in. So they said, we'll gladly fight and die for our country, the USA, but only when and if you release us and our parents and our children. That evidently was asking too much, so they were tried and imprisoned. Many in the JA community would have preferred that this unsavory bit of history be kept under the rug. But the exhibit showed us that difficult truths could be told. Contrary to the story then current, there was more than one way JAs demonstrated patriotism to the nation and deep understanding to allegiance to the Constitution. This exhibit tried to show the way. The Museum of American History did its part with another exhibition called Righting a Wrong, featuring the actual Executive Order 9066. Undersecretary Kevin Gover mentioned this. More exhibitions like it will be necessary if we are ever to inch closer to a more perfect union. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franklin, for your words. And I think as so much of what you said brought up, this session is such a wonderful opportunity to recognize and appreciate so many folks and organizations whose work over the past decades has made so much possible, truly embodying this idea of Okage Samade. Because of you, I am, that is infused into so much of our programming this weekend. So keeping with that, we will next hear from Dr. Karen Ishizuka, who is Chief Curator of the Japanese American National Museum and author of 2 books, Serve the People, Making Asian America in the Long 60s, and Lost and Found, Reclaiming the Japanese American Incarceration on the Making of the Exhibit America's Concentration Camps. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, everyone. This is quite a pleasure and an honor to be here. Erin, if you could start the first slide. I'm going to run through America's concentration camps and an exhibit that I curated for the Japanese American National Museum in 1994. So my goal for this exhibit was to introduce the camp experience to a broad audience, but from a survivor's perspective. And it was really this first-person personal strategy. We invited people, visitors, to add their own experiences to the exhibition. But we started the exhibition with this installation outside. And this is where the pavilion is now, our current museum. And you notice that we use the term concentration camp, and very deliberately and very with a lot of thoughtfulness, I think. We realized that the term had been vetted and used since the mid-70s, but we knew that as the Japanese American National Museum, our use of the term in the title would be significant. So we really talked to a lot of our advisors. One of my advisors at the time was Lonnie Bunch. We talked to Jewish leaders and organizations, as well as our staff, volunteers, and board. So it was, very significant for the museum to make that decision to use the term in 1994, which really sent the message, I think, that we are not afraid to call it what it was. Next slide, Erin. The exhibition, like I mentioned, started on the outside, and it consisted of 3 elements. There's a full-size barracks, and I learned in the process that the correct term for a single or multiple barracks is barracks. There's no such a word as barrack. We brought half of an original barracks down from Hart Mountain, plank by plank, and then supplemented it with the reconstructed barracks to indicate the entire, what an entire barracks would look like. We installed a 25-foot guard tower, and then you can see the billboard in the back. Docents gave tours and of it. And once again, it was, quite a bold statement. This is exactly where our pavilion, our present museum, stands today. Next slide, Erin. I mentioned that, it was a really first-person personal perspective. And inside the exhibition, which was in our historic building, which was in the former Nishi-Honganji Temple building built in 1925. The exhibition was designed by Ralph Applebaum Associates, who went on to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And next slide. The main exhibition took place in one large room with 11 camp layouts. We included Crystal City as a camp as well. We used the original government blueprints, and the idea was to contrast the official history. So on the banners, you can see, and you can't read, we had statistics, the population, dates of operation, areas in terms of acres, the number of births, deaths, weddings, number of people drafted from that camp, and the number of people segregated to Tule Lake. And then that was complemented and contrasted with the community memories, which included personal memorabilia and photos. Next slide, please. For this exhibit, we produced also the film called Something Strong Within, which later became a standalone. For those of you familiar, it's made up only of home movies. There's no voice of God narration, which really reinforced a internal perspective, a Japanese American perspective. And it opened with an entry from one of Yuri Kochiyama, who was Nakahara at the time, entry diary at Santa Anita. So I'm just going to quickly read it because I don't think you can read it. Courage is something strong within you that brings out the best in a person. Perhaps no one else may know or see, but it's those so many things unknown to others that reveals a person to God and self. Next slide. Most of our docents were actual survivors, and we had badges made up with the photos of them during World War II. And those docents that weren't in survivors or weren't in camp, they also had photos of themselves from 1942. Next slide. The exhibition strategy of first-person personal, there are many interactives for visitors to add their stories and to become part of the exhibit. On the barracks, the models themselves, people actually placed their barracks. Survivors placed the barracks, which was often, extremely emotional. We had a camp registry, and you can see this picture of Norm Minetta and George Takei. And they were included in camp registries, which were really simple 3-ring binders for survivors to just register in, to put their names into the exhibit. Docents took Polaroids of them. And, if they were deceased, a friend, a relative friend was invited to stand in, and one person actually came with the picture of his father that he held up in his own Polaroid picture. And so by the end of the exhibit, we had over almost 3,500 survivors make out pages for the registry. The comment books, the one on the right, comment books are common addendums to exhibitions. They provide feedback, but we also very specifically asked for people to include their own memories, their stories, or even commentary. So you can see that we had, so many people write in different languages, Japanese, you can see this one person taped a image of the Virgin de Guadalupe, in the comment. We also had a lost and found bulletin board for people to post people who were there looking for that they lost through the war. Next slide. When ACC, as we called it, traveled to Ellis Island 3 months before the opening, we were told that that the term concentration camp had to be removed from the title if we were to proceed. So we opened this up to everyone, the constituents, colleagues, realizing that the issue would ultimately affect the Japanese American community at large and also have, very serious implications for museology. So, very long story short, Senator Dan contacted the Secretary of Interior, Bruce Babbitt, and they oversee the National Park Service that governs the Ellis Island. So they basically indicated that as a public agency, all perspectives needed to be presented and that no censorship would prevail. We also had, a meeting hosted by the American Jewish Committee with representatives from American Jewish organizations across the country. And you can see that it became, very much of a national discussion, and it was even an international discussion. You can see it was in German. Next slide. Myself, at the end of the meeting, I, as a curator, and then 2 staff members from AJC were charged with writing a statement that would explain, why our use of the term. So I think you can read this. This is the first sentence of each paragraph and also the concluding sentence. So it was adopted with minor changes and then placed at the beginning of the Ellis Island exhibition and then also at every venue, thereafter. And there you can see some of the members of the meeting that took place. I think, the most important thing that this did was open up a discussion, both nationwide and internationally, regarding terminology and if certain words could be used only by specific communities. But, to me, this public dialogues really transcended the debate about whether we could use the term concentration camps, but really evoked questions about historical perspective, censorship, the free expression of ideas, and our own prejudices. What becomes history and from whose point of view? And also, why remember when we would just as soon forget? Reading the chats here. The next slide, Erin, please. It's important. I ended up writing a book on the process of making the exhibition, as well as stories that walked in the door at the time, the controversy over the concentration camp terminology, recovering from history, and recovering from history. And I really encourage everyone to document their projects. It is really important. Exhibitions in the end are ephemeral, but the written word is able to pass down the information and the process that we learned in the process. Okay, I'm going to just very quickly, I was asked to really talk about not only to look back in the past, but forward to the future. So I'd like to give you just a preview of the new core exhibit that the Japanese American National Museum is currently working on. So Erin, the next slide, please. as a core exhibit, it will provide an overview of the Japanese American experience from immigration to the present. And similar to our current core exhibit, but with four, I think, major distinctions. One is that there is going to be a real emphasis on our own diversity, our heterogeneity, in every way, geographic, gender, class, sexual orientation, including Hawaii AGA's Okinawan Americans. The second one is the emphasis on linkages with other communities. None of us, are here in a silo. We all impact and are impacted by each other. A third one was an emphasis on what can be learned rather than just remembering or commemorating. And then I think the last one was really to emphasize the legacy of both resistance and joy throughout our history. So the exhibition will be laid out chronologically, although we know that life does not march forward in a straight line. So things and issues like the trauma and lessons of the incarceration will be brought up at different times as well. Next slide, Erin. The second area would be settlement, and I've included some quotes that provide a feel for the era. And for settlement, really there's a Issei perspective and a Nisei perspective. Issei perspective, alien hardships made bearable by the hope I have for my children. And this other quote from John Okada from No No Boy: we were Japanese with Japanese feelings and Japanese pride and Japanese thoughts because it was all right to be Japanese and feel and think all the things that Japanese do, even if we lived in America. And this is a frame grab from some of our home movies from before the war. Next slide, please. Certainly the World War II, was a failure of democracy. We became enemies in our own country. Camp incarceration is definitely key, but we are mindful that many people did not go to camp. So this area will also include people from outside of the area that that had to go to camp. Next slide, please. The post-war years, Cold War, civil rights, Vietnam. The quote I chose here was from Cynthia Kadohata's book. The way to be Japanese in America was to be more American than the Americans. And this is a image on the naturalization of Issei that was in 1952 by Henry Sugimoto, this is in our collection. Next slide, please. The 60s, 70s, 80s was a real time of resistance and renaissance. Ethnic Asian American movements reflected really a worldwide cultural revolution for decolonization, self-definition, and determination. Last slide, please, Erin. And we're going to end the 1990s to the present. And this is a quote by Yuri: life is not what you alone make it, which is a reminder to us that we need to focus on what brings us together, as well as celebrating our differences. And we are really looking in this last room with a focus on solidarity, as we transition into a majority-minority nation. So thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to share these with you. And I look forward to the next speakers.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really feel so lucky that I'm able to learn from and work with you outside of this session too. And I'm looking forward to returning a little bit to that new core story permanent exhibition that we'll talk about in the Q&A. So now to introduce our next panelist, another inspiring community member and public historian committed to facilitating and fostering meaningful and engaging community programming, Hanako Akatsuki. Hanako is currently the superintendent at Honouliuli National Historic Site. Previously, she worked at Tule Lake National Monument, Minidoka National Historic Site, and Pearl Harbor National Memorial. Hanako, thank you so much for your work in putting together all of this programming, and thank you also for being here with us today.
Yeah, no, thank you all for having me on this panel, and I just want to kind of apologize if there's some noises in the background because I kind of live next to a street, so I apologize about that. But today I want to talk to you all about the importance of interpreting, this difficult history and any difficult history with care, because the National Park Service is considered as America's storyteller, and we need to make sure that we are being accurate about telling these histories. And as leaders in the interpretation and education field, we need to be leading this way, and leading in this endeavor. So I wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about my family history. So I'm Yonsei and Gosei, so that means I'm fourth and fifth generation. And I had 4 generations of my family incarcerated, everyone from my great-great-grandmother to my aunts and uncles. And so my father was actually the first child born free after the war. So in this image here, you see the bigger person in the background is my Auntie Jeannie, or my great Aunt Jeannie. And then the 2 folks kind of in the back of that front image is my grandmother and grandfather. Then I have my great-grandmother, my Aunt Patty, my great-great-grandmother, then my great-grandfather, and I think that's my Uncle George on his lap. So I do have, family ties here. And so we could take the image off now. But that's kind of one of the reasons why I do this work, because my family has this personal connection. But a lot of people don't realize that the Department of Interior actually oversaw the War Relocation Authority sites starting in 1944. And that's the War Relocation Authority sites are the 10 main camps that people think about. So at times, like me being in this position, it could be hard, wearing this badge, because I am working for the agency that oppressed my family. And I know that there's other folks, in the agency who have these same struggles, right? But the one thing is that the bureau that I work for, the National Park Service, is currently managing 6 of these sites, telling the Japanese American incarceration story, which, is really important. And I'm going to name off these sites. We have Manzanar National Historic Site in Eastern California, Minidoka National Historic Site in South Central Idaho, Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial across the Sound from Seattle, Washington. We also have Tule Lake National Monument in Northern California, the National Japanese American Memorial to Patriotism during World War II on the National Mall in DC, and then where I currently work at Honouliuli National Historic Site here in Hawaii. So this shows the National Park Service dedication to preserving this history. So the National Park Service has made it a point to tell these stories accurately without perpetuating the euphemistic terms that the US government and others employed at the time, or incorrect terms later substituted that do not adequately describe the injustice experienced by more than 120,000 people. So we as in the National Park Service, was able to get this institutionalized into the Harper's Ferry editorial style guide. And so that's a National Park Service style guide that we all kind of follow, which is helping us move forward. First, that the National Park Service is telling these histories accurately, but also institutionalizing it at a governmental level to recognize that, hey, we haven't been using the proper terminology to describe these situations. And, now we can see how this language, how this is impacting language, even that the White House is using. Take a look at the proclamation and the messages that came out yesterday, right? So representation matters, right? Because when we have representation, we can have a say in how our stories are being told. So when I look at the National Park Service, it's like, look at the Japanese Americans who are at these sites. We have like Dave Goto over at Manzanar, but we also have like Anna Tamada, Kara Miyagishima, Kelsey Larson at our regional offices as well. And then if we look at like Minidoka National Historic Site, we have Kurt Ikeda and Emily Teraoka and others across the service. But we also need to be bringing in people who have a connection to these, difficult stories that the Park Service preserves. So like, look at Erin, who's our, awesome moderator, and we jokingly call her our community fellow, right? She's been helping out telling these stories and helping out with our programming. Kurt Ikeda over at Minidoka, he was my intern 3 years ago at Minidoka, and now he's a director of education. And also with Emily Teraoka, she was an intern as well, and is now currently the lead interpreter at that site. So we need to make sure that we're able to cultivate the next generation of preservationists. So lastly, we need to be engaging the community to help direct how we develop these stories, at National Park Service sites, and work together in telling these stories in a manner that is befitting the subject. This is why we have this program this weekend. And also this happened at the beginning of the pandemic when Kimiko and I, we did Tadaima, a community virtual pilgrimage, with the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages, which in 2020 was, I believe, the largest NPS sponsored online program. It spanned 9 weeks, over 360 programs, over 100,000 viewers. And we had viewers from across 70 countries with over 70 community partners. And inadvertently, it became the largest secondary resource repository on the Japanese American incarceration history, and has been used as part of university courses across the nation, like at Brown University. And I hope that there's going to be a link in the chat provided, so if you want to take a look at that. But I kind of want to, keep this short because I know that we have other people that we want to hear from. But, I just hope that these types of programming can be used as a model for meaningful community engagement as we move forward towards other commemorative programs like America 250. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Hanako. And thank you really for all of your work and for constantly asking me to be your community fellow. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Shirley Higuchi. Shirley is the daughter of former Heart Mountain incarcerees, Dr. William Higuchi and the late Setsuko Saito. Inspired by her mother's deathbed admission of donating thousands of dollars to, quote, build something there, Shirley worked with the community to build the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, which today stands at the site of the former camp. Currently, Shirley is spearheading the Minetta Simpson Institute at Heart Mountain, which I know we'll hear about today. And in addition to her work as chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, Shirley is Associate Chief of Professional Practice for Justice, Legal, and State Advocacy at the American Psychological Association. Thank you so much, Shirley, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Erin. I really appreciate being invited. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about Secretary Bunch's call for racial reckoning. And I want to say that the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation is here to provide that support and fulfill that mission. For me, my mother's secret, and the reason why we call my book Setsuko's Secret, is that I learned much later in life on my mother's deathbed that she dreamed of something being built at the place where she was incarcerated as a child. And the feeling that she never really talked about it, and it was so late in life that I learned so much about Heart Mountain. I find that very sad in many ways, but I'm glad I found my community and connected with the Japanese Americans who are now promoting and really educating the public on this important topic. There was nothing in my high school history books, nothing in my college books that I knew of, and there was nothing in my law school. But the one thing I do remember is that my parents always took me to museums while I was growing up. And museums are an easy way for children, the youth, and our community to connect and learn about our history. And that's what we're doing at the Heart Mountain Wyoming Museum. And we really strive to appreciate and learn from the power of the place and many ancestors before us who lived on that land. But this is not only a Japanese American story, it's a Wyoming story. And it's a story that our nation needs to understand. And we listened to Secretary Minetta, who was incarcerated there as a child, along with my parents. He always has Heart Mountain, and we always have Heart Mountain looking in the rear view mirror. And we have our hands firmly placed on the steering wheel so that we're moving ahead and remaining vigilant for our constitutional and democratic principles. So how are we addressing the issue of racial reckoning? We are proceeding with the Minetta Simpson Institute, which I call all of you to get on our website and learn more about. We really want to honor Secretary Minetta and his incarceration experience and what he believes in, along with his colleague and friend, Senator Minetta, Senator Simpson. And we have a picture here of both of these gentlemen here. and a photograph or a drawing of what that institute will be. And in the wake of Asian American hate, Black Lives Matter and racial reckoning, the Muslim ban, etc., we have to come together to build a better future. And that requires working across the aisle, which Secretary Minetta and Senator Simpson have done. And we hope that could be a platform of where we'll be moving towards in the future. The building itself will be designed to replicate a mess hall that existed at Heart Mountain at the time. And this was a place that Block managers worked through complicated issues, where the Fair Play Committee resistors met, and where people could gather and talk and work through the issues that they were confronting at Heart Mountain during that time period. And we hope for the future we could gather at Heart Mountain and begin talking about the vexing issues that confront the United States and confront our country today. We'll be posting more information online, and I welcome you to get onto our website to learn more. But when my mother said on her deathbed, "Let's build something at Heart Mountain," she was talking about the power of place, the need to tell the story, and to never forget. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for sharing this work and some of your story. Finally, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Anne Burroughs, President and CEO of the Japanese American National Museum. Anne is an internationally recognized leader in the fields of human rights and social justice. For over 25 years, she has worked with leaders, organizations, and networks in the United States and abroad to promote diversity, racial justice, and a rights-based culture. Anne, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all of the support from JANM to make this programming and this weekend possible.
Thank you, Erin. Well, I have to say before I go into my remarks how profoundly moving it is to be with all of you on this panel and to know that there are so many folks who are tuned in as we remember the 80th anniversary of the Day of Remembrance. It's been, this panel has been so interesting for me. We marching forward as museums, as places of memory under this new banner that Secretary Lonnie Bunch has, this new call to action that Secretary Lonnie Bunch has shared with us, and his powerful vision that Kevin expounded on so eloquently earlier on in the program. So there's a new direction for all of us. That standard has been laid down, and I think we all have an enormous responsibility to move forward with that and to live up to that. I've also been so moved hearing about the groundbreaking exhibitions that have shaped the interpretation and the narrative and the memory of the incarceration. The stories of the power of place, of Honouliuli, of Heart Mountain, which are just so central to this narrative. So, I won't speak too much about JANM's history, but just to sort of point to a couple of things, because it's a history that, all of you know very well. But the founder's vision was to preserve the history of what happened during the incarceration so that it would never happen to any other group, so that no other group would be similarly targeted. So there was this deep commitment to preserve the history, to preserve the stories, and to preserve the artifacts. But more importantly, overlaid on that was this acknowledgement that there needed to be an incredibly powerful, strong movement around public education to ensure that history was never forgotten. So part of that strategy was to make JANM a national museum and to have this museum dedicated to Japanese American history firmly on the national stage so that the story would be embedded in the national consciousness, because of course we know from experiences in this country, and we know from experiences around the world, that when human rights abuses are shrouded in silence, they continue to happen, and there is that cycle of impunity, and that it never ends. JANM was formed 30 years ago. It's actually our 30th anniversary. We opened on the day of the Los Angeles Rebellion. So JANM was formed in that crucible of uprising. And certainly it was a powerful impetus for the trajectory of JANM's programming and the realization of its mission over the years. And certainly JANM became a leader amongst museums, not just in telling the story of the community that formed it, but specifically in looking at how it could use that history and how it could use that richness of community to celebrate the culture and the ethnic diversity of communities of color around the country that to expound on that collective experience of exclusion, of erasure, of discrimination and dispossession. And then, of course, almost 6 years ago, in the run-up to the presidential election in 2016, when it became, well, in fact, it was after the election, when it became clear what the next 4 years would look like, and when there were those calls by members of the incoming administration and acolytes that the incarceration of Japanese Americans should be used as a precedent to deal with, yes, the Muslim question and the immigration question. There became a renewed vigor and a sense of urgency to JANM's mission and to this incredibly important idea that we needed to, sorry about that. I'm trying to time myself. But there became this real strong recommitment that we needed to use that history to inform the present and to shape the future. And we were extraordinarily fortunate that our trustees stood firmly behind this. It was not always a comfortable position for us to take a social justice approach, but there were trustees who argued that it was the right thing to do. We needed to examine what memory means in the present and what memory means in the future. So this notion of JANM including a social justice approach really became sort of endemic, and it's a thread that we have been able to run through, all of our programs. And we also listened. We listened to the community. We asked people about what JANM should be. We listened deeply, not just to the Japanese American community, to people outside of the community, to help us understand the context that we found ourselves in and how we needed to move forward with the future. And I think that, given what has happened over the last 18 months in this country, the run up over the last, the sort of incredible damage of the last 4 years, JANM was ready, and we were able to speak with an incredibly powerful voice. We were able to respond powerfully to the conflagration that happened in 2021. We were able to speak loudly in response to the Asian hate and COVID, with the realization, of course, that it was just a heartbeat. It was a heartbeat. That hate was just a heartbeat away from 1942. Karen has spoken about the permanent exhibition that we're installing at JANM that will recontextualize Japanese American history and make it part of that broader American story, because that's what it is. It really is it's a milestone. It's part of that continuum of American history, and it needs to be placed there. We also are going to be relaunching our National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And what we want to do there is that we want to gather people together to examine the rights, the freedoms, and the enduring fragility of American democracy, but also really powerfully to have conversations about how Asian Americans have shaped democracy in this country and how democracy continues to shape Asian America. So, Erin, I know that my time is running out. My attempt to time myself a little bit earlier on was a little bit ham-fisted, but I certainly look forward to hearing questions, and it's been such a privilege. It really has, to have been on this panel with all of you, and thank you to all of the organizers for putting this conference together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to all back together. Better. Thank you so much. I know I speak for everyone watching when I say that was incredibly moving and really grounding, I think, to begin the weekend's programming and hearing about all of your reflections and the work that has been done and is continuing. We are just about out of time, but I do want to ask one question, or ask each of you to reflect on one thing before we sign off here, and something you just said stuck with me so much as sort of a theme of today: what memory means in the present, to think about this critically, and what memory will mean in the future. So I'm wondering, and Karen, I'm going to direct this question to you first and then turn to other folks on the panel here. As you are approaching this new core exhibition, this sort of new telling of Japanese American history, what directions or new stories or familiar stories do you think we need to tell or be retelling as we continue this work of reckoning with our history and sort of positioning Japanese American history as American history, as lessons that we all need to learn? So that's a very large question that I'm asking us to think about as we wrap up here. But Karen, I'll turn to you first.
Okay, thank you. I think, as everyone has said, this moment in our history now reverberates through time. And, as we look forward, as I mentioned, I think that I'm finding that the memory, the trauma of the incarceration, and during the war years, whether you were in camp or not, continues to come up. And, with Yonsei, with Gosei, I'm surprised, I'm sure our Issei forebears had no idea that this would continue in this way. Some things that I'm realizing is that we have, at this point, still so much to learn about our history and our experience. I think, every time we think we've heard it all, we haven't. Not only with the incarceration, but, I'm learning so much about the early immigrants who, didn't even call themselves Issei because they never intended to stay. They were immigrants who intended to come and to leave. So there's so much that we are still learning, and it involves a learning with our fellow Americans, so to speak. It really is, as I mentioned before, we are not in silos, although at times we feel, but, we are so impacted and have impact others. And it is going forward with this very broad notion of who we are, of really contextualizing Japanese America within the United States and the United States story.
Thank you so much, Karen. Hanako, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to go next?
Yes, please. Thank you. I just want to make a quick comment, just going off of what Karen was talking about, and what your original question was about, the who are we aspects. And, this is part of the larger American narrative, right? The American story narrative. And that's the one thing that, we as National Park Service is trying to help out with, where, we want to bring this up so people don't just, say, oh, this is a Japanese American history. This is part of our collective history, and kind of like what Kevin was talking about, where it's like we need to look at ourselves in the mirror so we can understand ourselves. Because if we can't look at ourselves as a nation, how can we create the better future for ourselves? If we don't want to understand where we came from. And so I just wanted to, put a shout out for the video that we did yesterday. Matthew John helped us create a short 2-minute video about who are we, right? And it's posing those questions. And we wanted to basically have other people be able to see themselves in our community and try to get past the face, right? Where it's like, oh, that's just a Japanese American story, or that's an Asian American story, but it's our story. So we try to deal with universal concepts to connect people with that. But I think moving forward as the National Park Service, and hopefully just for the community itself, is creating spaces like this to it provides an opportunity for healing, for discussion, and for community building. And I think that that's really important as we move forward. So we as a community could move forward, and we as a nation can as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanako, for sharing that. Shirley, I'd like to turn it to you. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, I think looking ahead to the future and really tackling the issues that are very difficult in this country today is an important thing for us to do. And I think using the Japanese American incarceration experience as a learning tool to teach our government and our communities what not to do during wartime hysteria or other crippling effects like the COVID outbreak, I think is a way to keep this story alive and very useful for our communities in the future. So I'll look towards those lessons as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Shirley. And Franklin, any thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think people have mentioned the necessity to learn from history for the country moving forward as a society. And I think that's quite accurate. For the past half century, I've been working a lot with young adults, folks in city colleges through elite universities like Amherst College. And what strikes me is that, I mean, we know a lot about suicide ideation and the stresses that afflict young people as they're trying to grow up in our society. I think understanding who they are, where they came from, what their parents have gone through, intergenerational kinds of understandings are really critical, not just for Japanese Americans, but for everybody. And I think the World War II JA experience is one model for folks to emulate.
Thank you, Franklin. Kevin, any final reflections or thoughts you'd like to share?
Just listening to everyone speak, I was reminded of what Dr. King said, that we're all caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Lonnie Bunch likes to say, we have this shared past and it belongs to all of us and we're all in it and we can't escape it. But we also have a shared future that we do get to build and define. And by knowing who we have been can certainly inform us in trying to be better than we are. In other words, to try to be a more perfect union.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Anne, I wanted to give you a little bit of a break from speaking there, but any final reflections you'd like to share?
I'm so struck, you know, listening to the panelist and listening to everybody. And I think for me, it's this idea, this notion of what democracy is about and what our collective responsibility is into shaping that. And of course, we know that democracy in history is shaped by people, by experiences. It's shaped by, you know, by dialogue, participation. Because if we don't do that, if we don't speak to each other, you know, we have absolutely no way of being able to transform attitudes. We can't influence culture, and we certainly can't promote an inclusive democracy if we don't do that. So for me, these conversations we're having today, the preservation of memory, understanding memory, I think what Franklin said about the multi-generational aspect of memory, that's the sort of continuum that runs through history. These conversations, these thoughts, these thinkings, this dialogue has never been more urgent or more relevant, I think. And, you know, our social frameworks are being challenged on a daily basis. They're being debated on a daily basis. And it feels to me there is such a pressing moment now for us to be able to shape them.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you again, Kevin, Hanako, Karen, Franklin, Shirley, and Anne for being on this panel. Thank you to folks who tuned in. We have one more sort of piece before we wrap up, and I'm going to turn it over to Anne and Shirley to wrap us up here.
Thank you, Erin. I feel as though I'm getting a lot of airtime, but I'm speaking to you now, not as President and CEO of JANM, but as the chair of the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium, which is a consortium. It's a group made up of Japanese American organizations from across the country. And we're dedicated to preserving the history, the stories, the artifacts, and the sites relating to the incarceration. We're also deeply committed to public education and advocacy to ensure that no other group is similarly targeted. All of the organizations in our consortium share these same values and share the same purpose. And it's our great honor. We've been so deeply moved by the direction that Secretary Bunch has given to the Smithsonian and to the museums, the clarion call to museums and people who are concerned with preserving memory around the country. His clarion call to bring Americans together by reckoning with its own racial past, that we have an award that we would like to present to Secretary Bunch, and Kevin is going to be receiving it on behalf of the Secretary. And I'm actually now going to turn it over to Shirley to read the words on the proclamation.
Yes, thank you very much. Undersecretary Gover, distinguished panelists, I'm honored to read this commendation to Secretary Lonnie Bunch III today on February 19th, 2022. On the 80th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, which condemned 120,000 people to imprisonment because of their race, we salute Secretary Lonnie Bunch for his commitment to creating a hopeful future for all people, using history and reconciliation to contextualize and transform our understandings and responses to race and racism. The Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium commends Secretary Bunch for putting the Smithsonian in the leadership for all museums and organizations to preserve, protect, and interpret history for all the people. Thank you so much. And we will be sending this over to the Secretary very quickly. So thank you, Kevin, for accepting this award.
Oh, Secretary Gover, I'm so sorry, you are muted.
You'd think I'd have it down by now, right? Thank you so much. On Lonnie's behalf, Lonnie would have been here, but he is traveling internationally at the request of the White House, and it's hard to say no when they make that request. But thank you so much. I know it means a great deal to him that people understand what he's trying to do with the Smithsonian, what he's trying to do with museums across the country, and really what he's trying to do for the United States itself. And so thank you, and we will keep the faith and keep working with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, I just want to also extend a final thank you to our planning partners, the Japanese American National Museum, the JACL National Chapter, Friends of Minidoka, and the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And a big thank you to Kimiko Mar, who is running everything behind the scenes. Thank you for making this so smooth. And to folks watching, please join us again in about 50 minutes for our second session, which is called Creating Paths to Justice, Healing, and Renewal. In the same place, we'll be back here. And thank you so much again, all of you, for being here with us today.